Chapter 1. Journey to Else. When professionals across all walks of life bind themselves to solemn oaths, medical practitioners swear an oath to preserve life and abstain from harm. Clergy members pledge themselves to a life of purity and service. Postal workers commit to delivering the mail regardless of the hazards of weather. It is a lesser-known fact that scholars of the human mind also share an unspoken covenant. At some point in our academic journeys, we feel an undeniable compulsion to compose a sentence that begins with a very specific phrase. The human being is the only animal that... We are permitted to complete the thought in whatever manner we choose, but those opening words are a professional rite of passage. Most of us delay this obligation for as long as possible, knowing full well that future generations of scholars will likely ignore decades of our meticulous research, choosing instead to remember us solely for how we concluded that one definitive statement. We also recognize the inherent risk. The bolder the claim, the more spectacular the potential for public humiliation. Those who finished the sentence by claiming humans were the exclusive users of language faced a reckoning when great apes were taught to communicate through signs. Those who claimed humans were the only toolmakers were similarly embarrassed when researchers observed primates stripping branches to extract insects from mounds. Consequently, scientists delay writing this sentence, quietly hoping to pass away before a clever primate can disprove their life's work. Yet, the time has come to fulfill this obligation. The human being is the only animal that contemplates the future. While pet owners might fiercely protest, citing a dog anticipating a walk or a squirrel burying a nut, there is a fundamental difference between acting in a way that secures a future outcome and actually conceptualizing that future. A squirrel stockpiling food is executing a biological script triggered by the waning autumn light, completely devoid of any philosophical meditation on the coming winter. The creature knows about tomorrow in the same blind, mechanical way that a falling leaf knows about gravity. Until an animal can weep over the prospect of aging alone or decline a treat to fit into a summer coat, the assertion stands. Our capacity to envision a time that has not yet arrived is a defining, singular characteristic of our humanity. When asked to identify the crown jewel of human achievement, one might immediately point to towering monuments, space stations, or feats of engineering. Yet, a highly advanced machine could replicate these constructs, given enough data and material. The true marvel of our species is conscious experience itself. To perceive the world as an extraordinary biological feat, to recall the world as it was, is even more miraculous. But to imagine, to simulate a reality that does not exist and has never existed, is the absolute zenith of cognitive evolution. Our minds are essentially anticipation machines. All brains, from the simplest sea slug to the most complex primate, engage in a rudimentary form of prediction. They use immediate sensory inputs and past associations to anticipate what will happen in the next fraction of a second. This biological process requires no conscious thought whatsoever. A nervous system simply links a current smell with a past threat to prepare for an imminent attack. This is less about profound foresight and more about a continuous automatic assessment of the immediate local environment, a process better described as nexting. Right now, as these words unfold, a neurological mechanism is actively guessing the identity of the very next word, allowing for a seamless flow of comprehension. We remain entirely oblivious to this frantic, unconscious forecasting until the prediction fails. When a sentence abruptly ends with a piece of furniture, we experience surprise. Surprise is the psychological tremor that occurs when reality violates our brain's unspoken expectations, proving that we were anticipating something else entirely. From infants staring in bewilderment at objects that defy the laws of physics, to monkeys reacting to magic tricks, this relentless nexting keeps us anchored and prepared for the immediate moment. Yet this automatic reflex is a far cry from the sweeping grand visions of tomorrow that actually lifted our ancestors out of the prehistoric canopy. The transition from a creature bound to the present to one capable of mental time travel was a monumental leap. If you ask young children what they wish to be when they grow up, they often offer charmingly absurd answers, not because they are foolish, but because they have absolutely no genuine conception of later. They inhabit a world composed entirely of now. As we mature, however, we cross a cognitive threshold. We gain the astonishing ability to close our eyes and transport our consciousness years, even decades, into a realm of pure possibility. This profound awakening occurred relatively recently in our evolutionary history, coinciding with a sudden and massive expansion of the human brain. Nature did not simply inflate our existing neural architecture, it disproportionately swelled the frontal lobe, profoundly altering the shape of our skulls to accommodate this new machinery. For a long time, the medical community grossly misunderstood the purpose of this newly evolved cerebral real estate. Early medical anomalies, such as railway workers surviving horrific brain trauma, suggested that a person could lose significant portions of their frontal lobe and still function, speak, and remember. This led to the tragic era of the frontal lobotomy, a procedure praised for its ability to pacify agitated patients. It was only later that the devastating cost of this calm was fully realized. While patients with frontal lobe damage could still score highly on intelligence tests and engage in normal conversation, they lost something invisible yet profoundly vital, the capacity to plan. When asked to organize a sequence of actions or describe what they intended to do later in the afternoon, their minds went entirely blank. They had been severed from their own tomorrows. The frontal lobe is the neurological engine of foresight. Without it, the future ceases to exist, and the individual is permanently marooned in the present moment, unable to feel the anxiety of anticipation or the thrill of an imagined triumph. Given how effortlessly we project ourselves into the future, it takes intense mental discipline, such as rigorous meditation, to force the mind to remain entirely in the present. We are chronic time travelers, spending a vast portion of our waking hours wandering through landscapes that have not yet materialized. We daydream about professional triumphs and romantic conquests because the mere act of simulating these joyful scenarios is intrinsically pleasurable. Sometimes the anticipation of an event is far sweeter than the actual experience, leading us to delay gratification simply to savor the mental preview a little longer. This chronic mental simulation tends to skew positive. Because we prefer to imagine our successes rather than our failures, we cultivate an unfounded optimism about our personal destinies, convinced that our lives will inevitably be better, healthier, and more prosperous than average. However, our mental theater does not solely project comedies and romances. It frequently forces us to sit through horror films of our own making. We torment ourselves with visions of missing critical flights, deeply embarrassing ourselves at social gatherings, or receiving devastating medical diagnoses. Why would a brain deliberately subject itself to such distressing imagery? First, anticipating a painful event often dulls its eventual sting. A sudden, unexpected shock is vastly more terrifying than a hazard we have braced ourselves to endure. Second, fear is an unparalleled motivator. Just as we caution children about the dire consequences of misbehavior, we manufacture dark visions of our own future to scare ourselves into acting prudently today. We envision the poverty of our old age to motivate our current frugality, using imaginary terror to ensure practical survival. Yet beyond the simple pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain, there is a much deeper reason why we obsessively manufacture tomorrows. We desperately want to control them. The human animal is born with an innate, insatiable appetite for agency. From the moment an infant realizes it can manipulate its limbs to knock over a block, the joy of causing an effect takes hold. Having an impact on the world is a fundamental psychological need, and the loss of that control can lead to profound despair, declining health, and even premature death. We crave the steering wheel of our own lives so intensely that we often trick ourselves into believing we possess control over entirely random events, such as the rolling of dice or the drawing of lottery numbers. The sheer sensation of being the captain of our fate is deeply rewarding in and of itself. But we do not merely steer for the thrill of turning the wheel, we steer because we believe we know exactly where we should dock the ship. We use our power of foresight to evaluate the countless potential destinies that stretch out before us, fully convinced that we can identify which shores will bring us eternal bliss and which will bring us ruin. It seems entirely self-evident that by imagining the future, we can navigate toward the best possible life. It is an obvious, intuitive, and universally accepted truth. It also happens to be completely wrong. Our attempts to chart a course toward a happy future are constantly thwarted, not because we lack the power to steer, but because our vision of the destination is fundamentally distorted. Just as the eyes can be tricked by optical illusions, our imaginations are consistently duped by illusions of foresight. The mind is a flawed prophet, subject to hidden mechanisms that skew our understanding of what will truly bring us satisfaction. To understand why we so frequently arrive at the future only to find it entirely different from what we expected, we must systematically expose the blind spots in our mental time machines. We must examine how quickly our imagination leaps to conclusions without consulting us, why the tomorrows we conjure look suspiciously like today, and why we are so utterly incapable of predicting how we will feel once we finally reach the place we fought so hard to find. Part 2. Subjectivity. Chapter 2. The View from In Here. Laurie and Reba are siblings who share a life more intimately than most could ever fathom. Reba, a soft-spoken woman who abstains from alcohol, has carved out a modest but award-winning career as a country singer. Laurie is her stark opposite, a boisterous hospital worker with a quick wit and a distinct fondness for strawberry daiquiris, harboring dreams of one day settling down to raise a family. They bicker and tease as sisters naturally do, completing one another's thoughts with effortless familiarity. However, their existence features a rather profound physical reality. They are conjoined twins. Since the moment of their birth, they have been united at the forehead, sharing not just a blood supply and portions of brain tissue, but an unbroken, face-to-face gaze that has lasted their entire lives. What is most remarkable about Laurie and Reba, however, is not their anatomical circumstance, but their emotional state. By their own accounts, they are overwhelmingly joyful, optimistic, and playful. When pressed by outsiders about the prospect of a surgical separation, their response is swift and unequivocal. They cannot fathom why anyone would want to disrupt their union, arguing that such an intervention would destroy two perfectly good lives. If we were to place ourselves in their shoes, honesty would likely compel us to admit that we would feel utterly despondent. The conventional medical establishment echoes this sentiment, often treating conjoined existence as a tragedy to be corrected at almost any cost, even if the procedure risks the lives of the twins involved. The overarching assumption is that such an existence could not possibly yield a life worth living. Yet, standing in stark defiance of our collective certainty, are Laurie and Reba themselves, insisting that they would not trade their lives for anything. This presents a peculiar philosophical dilemma. Either the twins are fundamentally mistaken about their own joy, or the rest of the world is completely wrong about the nature of happiness. Naturally, we are inclined to dismiss their claims. We tell ourselves that they do not truly understand what happiness is, subtly implying that we, the observers, hold the definitive blueprint for joy. But what exactly are we talking about when we invoke this elusive word? If one dives into the vast ocean of literature attempting to define happiness, one quickly drowns in semantic confusion. The word is asked to carry an impossibly heavy load, referring to at least 3 distinct realms of human experience. The most foundational of these is the raw, subjective feeling. Trying to articulate this basic emotional state is like trying to explain the concept of "thee" to a child. It is so elemental that words fail us. If an extraterrestrial visitor were to demand a definition of this feeling, we could only point to the things that trigger it: the smell of a lover's hair, the taste of rich chocolate, or the sound of a forgotten favorite song. We might try to define it by comparing it to other emotions, but subjective states are ultimately irreducible. As the famous quip goes, writing about such things is akin to dancing about architecture. If the alien lacks the biological machinery to feel, no amount of pointing or comparing will bridge the gap. Yet when we experience this feeling, we are never in doubt of its reality. The pursuit of this internal warmth seems to be the central engine of human motivation. Even when we subject ourselves to temporary misery, working grueling hours or denying ourselves a decadent meal, we usually do so under the assumption that these sacrifices will yield a greater emotional dividend down the road. Desiring something is practically synonymous with believing it will bring us pleasure. So how did such a universally sought-after feeling become the subject of so much intellectual hand-wringing? The trouble began when classical thinkers decided that striving merely for a good feeling was somewhat undignified, likening it to the mindless contentment of a well-fed farm animal. A life dedicated solely to chasing pleasure seemed unworthy of a sophisticated creature. Thus, philosophers began to insist that the word should be reserved for a very specific, elevated kind of joy, one achieved only through moral righteousness, deep intellectual engagement, and virtuous living. This classical redefinition may have offered a noble ideal, but it severely muddled the conversation. While a life of virtue might indeed cause a person to feel good, the actions that produce the feeling are not the feeling itself. Confusing the cause with the consequence forces us into absurd intellectual gymnastics, such as arguing that a wicked person lounging on a tropical beach is not actually experiencing pleasure, while a pious martyr suffering a gruesome fate is internally radiant. we must untangle the morality of an action from the reality of the emotion it produces. A villain can experience genuine pleasure just as a saint can experience genuine agony. The linguistic tangle worsens when we examine how the word is used to express judgments rather than emotions. We frequently declare that we are happy about a particular outcome, even when our internal landscape is bleak. If a partner announces a sudden career relocation that leaves us behind to manage the household alone, we might grit our teeth and say we are happy for their success. This is not a description of a joyful flutter in our chest. It is a declaration of our intellectual stance. We are acknowledging that the event is a valid source of joy for them, and perhaps even indicating our moral approval, while simultaneously experiencing profound personal distress. But even if we strip away the moral and judgmental baggage and focus solely on the raw emotional experience, a deeper mystery remains. Does the quiet satisfaction of a selfless deed feel fundamentally different from the sensory rush of eating a slice of coconut cream pie? How could we ever know? We cannot step outside our own consciousness to try on another person's subjective state. I can never be truly certain that the color I experience when I look at a school bus is the exact same internal hue that you experience. We have simply learned to use the same label for it. Perhaps then we should look inward and compare our own experiences. Surely we can remember the taste of yesterday's dessert well enough to compare it against today's charitable act. Unfortunately, the human memory is a notoriously flawed instrument. When we recall an event, we do not replay a high-fidelity recording. Instead, we rely on the rudimentary verbal labels we attached to the experience as it faded. The act of describing an experience can actually overwrite the visceral memory of it, leaving us with a recollection of our own words rather than the texture of the original moment. We remember that the wine was disappointing, but we cannot actually resurrect the taste on our tongue. To bypass the unreliability of memory, we might try comparing two experiences occurring in rapid succession. Yet, experiments reveal that even our immediate perception is stunningly vulnerable to oversight. Unless our attention is laser-focused on a specific detail at the precise millisecond it shifts, sweeping changes in our environment can occur completely unnoticed. A conversational partner can be swapped out for an entirely different person, while our view is briefly obstructed, and our brains will seamlessly bridge the gap, entirely blind to the discontinuity. We rely on memory to detect changes in our ongoing reality, and because memory falters, our perception is far more disjointed than it feels. This brings us back to Laurie and Reba. If our own memories and perceptions are so easily duped, how can we confidently evaluate the twins' claims of profound joy? We might resort to the argument that their unique circumstances have given them a stunted emotional vocabulary. Because they have never experienced the solitary freedom of a solo vacation or the physical thrill of certain physical feats, we suspect that their highest peak of joy is objectively lower than ours. When they receive a simple birthday cake and declare it an absolute ecstasy, we assume they are using the highest word on their internal scale to describe a feeling we would consider merely pleasant. This is the assumption that their limited background has compressed their language, forcing them to use grandiose words for mediocre sensations. While this perspective allows us to maintain the comforting belief that our lives are objectively superior, it is built on shaky ground. If their emotional background is limited because they haven't had our experiences, then ours is equally limited because we have never experienced the profound, inescapable, and absolute companionship they share. Furthermore, no experience can be cleanly unlearned. Once we are exposed to a new standard, whether it is the answer to a complex puzzle or the taste of a superior vintage, our perspective is permanently altered. We cannot revert to the innocence of our previous ignorance. If the twins were suddenly separated and found they preferred life apart, it would only prove that their new experience had fundamentally changed them, not that they were mistaken about their happiness before. Instead of assuming their language is compressed, we might consider that their experience is stretched. Perhaps the absolute joy they derive from a birthday cake is internally identical to the thrill we feel when diving into the ocean. The capacity for joy might expand to fill the container it is given. An individual stranded in the desert will experience the same staggering euphoria from a sip of rusty water as a billionaire might feel acquiring a masterpiece. Once we are exposed to richer, more complex pleasures, our internal baseline shifts and the simpler joys no longer register with the same intensity. Ultimately, every declaration of happiness is tethered to the unique vantage point of the person making it. There is no objective, omniscient platform from which to measure and compare the inner lives of different humans. When an exhausted, frost-bitten explorer scribbles in his journal that he is feeling happy as his lifeboat approaches a desolate rock, we cannot easily translate his internal state into our own vocabulary. Evaluating the subjective experiences of others, and even our own future selves, is an immensely complicated endeavor, fraught with illusions and unseen boundaries. Chapter 3. Outside. Looking in. Among the limited repertoire of jokes traded by psychology professors, one goes like this. Two academics pass each other in the corridor, and one says, "Hello, you are doing perfectly fine. How am I?" The punchline hinges on an absurdity. We operate under the assumption that while the internal states of others are opaque to us, our own emotions should be entirely transparent. It is natural to ask someone else how they are feeling, but highly unnatural to ask them to diagnose our own emotional state. Yet, as bizarre as it sounds, there are moments when we are entirely estranged from our own hearts. When we hear the surprising claims of conjoined twins who profess to be filled with joy, we might suspect that they are simply mistaken about their own feelings. Can someone genuinely be wrong about their own emotional experience? While we readily admit our ignorance regarding historical facts or economic trends, the idea that we might be mistaken about our own joy or sorrow seems preposterous. Nevertheless, the evidence suggests that we frequently fail to answer the most fundamental question of our own existence: how we are truly feeling. Before proceeding further, pause for a moment and take a close, deliberate look at your own hand. Most likely, you skipped this exercise, assuming it to be a trivial request. Observing a hand, a pastry, or a dangerous predator feels utterly effortless. Yet, in the microscopic interval between light reflecting off an object and our conscious recognition of it, the brain is executing an astonishingly complex analysis. It must extract physical features, cross-reference them with memory, and determine both the identity of the object and the appropriate response. If we were engineering a cognitive system from scratch, we might program it to first identify the threat, perhaps noting the bristling fur and bared fangs of a wild animal, and only then decide to flee. Evolution, however, did not build the human brain from a blank slate. The primal, survival-driven mechanisms sit at the base of our neurology, while the sophisticated analytical functions were layered on top over millennia. Consequently, our brains are wired to answer the urgent question of, "What should I do?" milliseconds before they answer the intellectual question of, "What is this?" This means that when you turn a corner and encounter a terrifying creature, there is a fleeting fraction of a second where your brain knows you are in danger before it actually knows what the danger is. It recognizes the abstract category of scary before it completes the full rendering of the specific animal. Your glands are already pumping adrenaline, your heart rate is accelerating, and your muscles are tensing for an escape before your conscious mind has fully processed the visual data. This phenomenon, feeling a physiological arousal without knowing its exact source, has profound implications for our emotional self-awareness. Consider a classic psychological experiment conducted on a precarious, swaying suspension bridge suspended hundreds of feet above a river. A female researcher approached male passers-by on this terrifying structure, asking them to complete a survey and offering her phone number for follow-up. A control group was approached only after they had crossed and reached solid ground. The men interviewed in the middle of the terrifying bridge were significantly more likely to call her later. Their brains had correctly identified a state of intense physiological arousal, pounding hearts and sweaty palms, but they misattributed the cause. They confused the adrenaline of mortal terror with the flush of romantic attraction. They literally did not know what they were feeling. This misattribution of emotion suggests that the physical sensations of fear can masquerade as lust, just as anxiety can be mistaken for shame or guilt. But even if we mislabel our arousal, surely we always know that we are feeling something. Is it possible to be entirely numb to an emotion while simultaneously experiencing it? Imagine sitting at a bustling outdoor cafe on a vibrant spring morning. You are deeply engrossed in a dense newspaper article about political reform. The aroma of freshly baked bread drifts over, a songbird calls from a nearby tree, and you suddenly realize your eyes have been scanning the text for 2 whole paragraphs without absorbing a single concept. Did you read those words? Yes, you can recall their shapes and perhaps even the internal voice that sounded them out. But were you aware of reading them? No. You experienced the text, but your awareness had drifted away. To understand this, we must separate the concept of experience from the concept of awareness. Experience implies engagement, while awareness implies observation of that engagement. We can experience the sweetness of a dessert without actively monitoring that we are experiencing it. But what happens if awareness is permanently decoupled from experience? Neurological conditions provide haunting examples. Individuals with a condition known as blind sight suffer damage to the visual cortex. They will adamantly and truthfully insist that they are entirely blind, yet if asked to guess the location of a light flashed on a wall, their hands will point accurately. They are experiencing the visual data, but they lack the conscious awareness of seeing. A similar decoupling can occur with human emotion. People diagnosed with alexithymia possess a normal physiological response to emotionally charged imagery. Their bodies react to horrific or joyful pictures just as anyone else's would, but they report feeling nothing. They lack the introspective vocabulary and the conscious awareness of their own internal states. They are experiencing the emotion, but they are utterly numb to its presence in their minds. It is entirely possible to be happy, sad, or terrified and have absolutely no idea that it is happening. If our own emotional experience can be so elusive, the scientific study of happiness might seem like a fool's errand. Science demands measurement. If we cannot perfectly trust our own assessment of our feelings, how can researchers ever hope to build an objective framework for studying subjective joy? The history of science is filled with paradigm shifts that make us feel ignorant in the face of what we once thought obvious. But if a phenomenon cannot be quantified, it is relegated to the realm of poetry and philosophy. The challenge of creating a perfect instrument, a flawless, objective gauge of internal bliss, seems insurmountable. However, the abyss between the subjective mind and scientific measurement can be bridged if we are willing to accept three crucial premises about the nature of observation. The first premise requires us to embrace the utility of imperfect tools. A carpenter knows that a slightly warped ruler is vastly superior to measuring wood by eye alone. Every scientific instrument, from the telescope to the barometer, contains a margin of error. If we discarded every tool that offered only an approximation of the truth, we would have to abandon physics, medicine, and economics altogether. The second premise is that, despite its flaws, an attentive individual's honest, real-time report of their own feelings remains the gold standard of emotional measurement. We have invented sophisticated machines to track brain blood flow, measure pupil dilation, and record the microcontractions of facial muscles. But the only reason we know that a specific facial muscle corresponds to joy is because people who exhibit that contraction consistently tell us they feel happy. If they suddenly began reporting deep despair whenever they smiled, our physiological maps would have to be rewritten. The individual, sitting at the solitary vantage point of their own consciousness, is the ultimate arbiter of their internal world. We must rely on their testimony because they are the only observer with access to the phenomenon in question. The third premise acknowledges that measurement errors become manageable when we leverage the power of scale. A single scratch on a lens might lead an astronomer to falsely conclude there is a fracture in the universe. But if thousands of telescopes are used, the idiosyncratic flaws of any single instrument are drowned out by the consensus of the data. This is the magic of large numbers. If you flip a coin 4 times and it lands on heads 3 times, a minor gust of wind or a sweaty thumb could easily account for the anomaly. But if you flip it 4 million times and see a disproportionate result, you can be certain that an underlying law is at work. In the science of human experience, this means that while one person's verbal report might be skewed by a unique interpretation of the word happy or a fading memory of an earlier emotion, the collective reports of thousands of individuals will cancel out those personal eccentricities. The quirks of vocabulary and memory fade into statistical irrelevance, leaving behind a reliable approximation of the human condition. There is a temptation to dismiss feelings as mere ephemeral whims, trivialities in a world dominated by war, disease, and commerce. But war, disease, and commerce only matter because of the feelings they induce. Every human endeavor, from the pursuit of wealth to the creation of art, is ultimately a pursuit of a desired emotional state. Without the capacity for suffering and joy, no event would hold any significance whatsoever. Our feelings are the foundational metric of value. Understanding them and understanding why we consistently fail to predict them is not a frivolous exercise. It is the most vital puzzle of our existence. With a solid grasp of how subjective experience can be studied, we are now prepared to examine the specific, systematic illusions that corrupt our foresight and uncover exactly why the futures we painstakingly design so rarely deliver the emotional payoffs we expect. Part 3. Realism. Chapter 4. In the blind spot of the mind's eye. There is an undeniable historical record concerning a man named Adolf Fischer. He did not orchestrate the deadly Chicago labor riot of 1886. He did not provoke the violence, and, in truth, he was nowhere in the vicinity when the fatal clash with the police occurred. Yet, his union had dared to challenge the formidable industrial barons who exploited the city's impoverished workforce, and for that audacity, a harsh penalty was demanded. Based on fabricated testimony, Fischer was convicted of a crime he never committed and condemned to hang. On the day of his execution, he stood before the gallows and delivered a final statement that utterly bewildered his audience. He declared that it was the happiest moment of his entire life. Moments later, the floor dropped, and he perished. By a striking coincidence, just a year after Fischer's execution, a brilliant young innovator successfully developed a new method for dry photography, introduced a groundbreaking camera to the public, and amassed an almost unimaginable fortune. This man, George Eastman, also possessed a deeply progressive vision for labor. Over his career, he bestowed upon his employees reduced working hours, retirement funds, life insurance, and even a significant share of the company's stock. Yet, on a spring day in 1932, this universally admired inventor and philanthropist sat at his desk, penned a short note, carefully closed his fountain pen, smoked a final cigarette, and then stunned the world by taking his own life. The juxtaposition of Fischer and Eastman presents a profound psychological puzzle. Both men championed the rights of the working class and devoted themselves to social progress at the dawn of the industrial era. However, Fischer's crusade ended in dismal failure, poverty, and public disgrace, while Eastman's culminated in absolute triumph, boundless wealth, and widespread reverence. Why then did the impoverished, condemned man greet his horrific end with joy, while the affluent, celebrated man chose to escape his seemingly perfect existence? Their emotional responses to their respective fates appear entirely inverted. If we were to project ourselves into their situations, our intuition tells us we would feel precisely the opposite. One is tempted to dismiss their behaviors as sheer madness or false bravado, but there is a far more unsettling possibility. Neither Fischer nor Eastman was mistaken about how they felt. Instead, the error lies with us. When we attempt to simulate what it would feel like to inhabit their lives, our imaginations make systematic, predictable blunders. Projecting ourselves into future scenarios is not merely an idle pastime. It is the very foundation of our most critical life choices. We decide whom to marry, which career to pursue, and where to live based on our mental simulations of how those choices will make us feel. We are absolutely convinced that we know which paths lead to joy and which lead to sorrow. We trust our ability to look down the corridor of time and accurately assess the emotional weight of a reality that does not yet exist. Yet, if our intuitive assessment of Fischer and Eastman's lives is fundamentally flawed, it suggests that our mental time machine is compromised. The lives we perceive as objectively better might actually be worse, and our incapacity to tell the difference can lead us to chase the wrong destinies. To understand why our foresight so frequently betrays us, we must examine a hidden trick our brains perform every single day. Little Big Head. In classic cinema, there is often a comedic gag where a character reaches into the pocket of an ordinary coat and pulls out an object of impossible proportions, a trombone, a ladder, or perhaps a farm animal. The humor relies on our basic understanding of physical space. Large objects simply cannot fit inside small containers. Yet, the human brain executes a very similar, albeit entirely real, illusion. Our minds store the vast, sprawling universe of our lifetime experiences within a small mass of tissue. The sheer volume of sensory data, sights, sounds, smells, spatial dimensions, emotional undertones should quickly overwhelm our cranial hard drives. So how does the brain accommodate this colossal amount of information? It cheats. It compresses our experiences, reducing them to a sparse collection of key features and summary tags. Filling in memory. When we seek to recall a memory, our brains do not retrieve a high-definition recording. Instead, they use those few saved threads to rapidly reweave the entire tapestry of the event. This fabrication process is so swift and seamless that we are entirely fooled into believing that the complete, vivid picture was resting in our memory all along. This illusion of retrieval is easily exposed. In various psychological experiments, subjects are shown a sequence of images, such as a car approaching a yield sign before an accident. Later, researchers casually ask some subjects a question that introduces a false detail, for example mentioning a stop sign instead of a yield sign. When subsequently asked to identify the image they originally saw, the majority of those exposed to the misleading question will confidently select an image featuring a stop sign. Because the brain weaves memories on demand, it readily incorporates new information supplied after the event, blending it so perfectly that the individual cannot distinguish the authentic memory from the suggested detail. The phenomenon of memory reconstruction happens constantly, and it is entirely undetectable to the conscious mind. We do not vaguely guess at the past. We remember these fabricated details with absolute, unwavering certainty. The brain simply uses the gist of an experience to manufacture the missing pieces, assuming that if the overarching theme is correct, the invented details must be too. Filling in perception. This undetectable fabrication does not only warp our memories of the past, it heavily edits our perception of the present. Deep within the anatomy of the human eye, there is a specific location where the optic nerve connects to the retina. Because there are no visual receptors at this junction, it creates a literal blind spot in our field of vision. Yet, as we survey a room, we do not perceive a gaping black void hovering in our sight line. Why do we experience a seamless visual field? Because the brain actively invents the missing visual data. It analyzes the colors and patterns surrounding the blind spot and makes an educated guess about what should logically be there, instantly filling in the gap. The light physically striking your retina and the imagery your brain completely manufactures appear entirely identical to your conscious mind. This perceptual forgery extends to our hearing as well. When researchers deliberately obscure a syllable in an audio recording with a burst of static or a cough, listeners reliably report hearing the missing sound anyway. The brain anticipates what the word should be based on the context of the sentence and effortlessly supplies the auditory experience, placing the phantom sound in its precise, correct sequence. Knowing about this phenomenon does not prevent it from happening. The brain's editing room remains strictly off limits to conscious intervention. The Meatloaf of Oz. In a famous children's tale, a group of travelers cowers before a terrifying, giant floating head, only to discover a small, ordinary man pulling levers behind a curtain. The great and powerful wizard admits his deception, revealing that the awe-inspiring apparition was nothing more than a carefully orchestrated illusion. For centuries, philosophers operated under the assumption that the human mind was essentially a passive screen, faithfully displaying the objective reality transmitted by the senses. This philosophical stance, known as realism, posited that we see things exactly as they exist in the physical world. However, later thinkers ripped back the curtain on this assumption, revealing that the brain is far more like the wizard's machine. Discovering idealism. The revolutionary philosophy of idealism proposed that our perception of reality is a highly manufactured product. The brain does not simply pass along sensory data, it actively combines that data with our pre-existing knowledge, expectations, and desires to construct a cohesive portrait of the world. Our experience of reality is heavily molded by the apparatus that perceives it. Psychologists later observed that we all begin life as staunch realists. Young children cannot grasp that their subjective perception is distinct from objective reality. If a toddler knows a toy is hidden in a specific drawer, she assumes everyone else entering the room must automatically know it too. She cannot distinguish between the world as it is and the world as she understands it. As we mature, we slowly adopt an idealist perspective, realizing that other minds possess different information and different points of view. We learn that our personal experience is just one interpretation of reality. Escaping realism. However, we never truly abandon our infantile realism. Even as sophisticated adults, our immediate reflexive response is to believe that our subjective experience perfectly mirrors objective truth. Consider an experiment where two people sit across from a grid of cubbyholes containing various objects. Some cubbyholes are transparent on both sides, while others have a back panel, making the objects within them visible to only one person. If the person with the restricted view asks their partner to move the small object, the partner must realize that the speaker can only be referring to the smallest object they can actually see, not an even smaller object hidden from their view. While adult participants almost always correctly reach for the object the speaker intended, sophisticated eye-tracking equipment reveals a hidden hesitation. Before their hand moves, their eyes instinctively dart toward the smallest object from their own personal perspective. For a fraction of a second, the adult brain acts like a realist, automatically assuming that the speaker's words apply to the world exactly as the listener perceives it. Only after a moment of cognitive correction does the brain override this assumption and consider the other person's limited vantage point. We do not outgrow the illusion of realism, we merely learn to rapidly unravel it when necessary. Our brilliant brains are master counterfeiters, presenting us with a version of reality so compelling and seamless that we rarely question its authenticity. We accept the brain's interpretations as unvarnished facts, oblivious to the extensive editing that occurred before the image reached our consciousness. An embarrassment of tomorrows. When we are asked to envision a future event, say, eating a particular meal tomorrow evening, our imagination springs to life with astonishing speed. We do not have to strain to build the mental picture. It arrives instantly, fully formed. But just as we fail to notice the brain filling in the visual blind spot, we fail to notice the brain aggressively filling in the details of the future. If asked to predict how much we will enjoy that future meal, we base our emotional forecast on the highly specific, detailed image our brain just conjured. We imagine a certain type of sauce, a specific atmosphere, a particular level of hunger. The problem is that the actual future event is merely a vague category, while our mental image is just one highly specific variation of it. Our emotional prediction relies entirely on those arbitrarily invented details. We treat the imaginary scenario as if it were a factual blueprint, failing to recognize that we are reacting to our own mental forgery. We confidently decline invitations to gatherings because our brains instantly paint a vivid, dreary picture of stiff conversations and stale appetizers, only to be dragged along and discover a raucous, joyful celebration. We misjudged the event because we mistook our brain's highly specific, pessimistic fabrication for a factual preview. This brings us back to Adolf Fischer and George Eastman. When we try to simulate the emotional realities of the Haymarket martyr and the Kodak billionaire, our imaginations unquestioningly inject an enormous amount of presumed detail. We imagine Fischer's execution solely through a lens of terror and humiliation, completely overlooking the profound spiritual vindication of a man who believed his sacrifice would ignite a historical movement for justice. We imagine Eastman's wealth through a lens of perpetual luxury, failing to consider the suffocating despair of an active, vibrant man whose body was deteriorating from agonizing spinal disease, promising only a future of helplessness. Our shock at their emotional responses stems from our failure to recognize that our mental simulations are deeply flawed portraits. We act as unrepentant realists, blindly trusting the scenes our imaginations construct from airy nothing. Onward. Our brains are magnificently equipped to synthesize a smooth, cohesive reality from fragmented data. Without this capability, our memories would be shattered, our imaginations barren, and our visual field riddled with literal holes. But this seamlessness is deceptive. The machinery that so effectively fills in the gaps operates in total secrecy, leaving us with the profound misconception that our mental simulations accurately represent the objective world. We trust the details our imagination supplies, remaining blissfully ignorant of the liberties it has taken. However, as we explore further, we will discover that the details our brains invent are only half the problem. The details they systematically leave out are just as dangerous to our pursuit of future happiness. Chapter 5. The Hound of Silence. In the classic mystery of a stolen prize racehorse, Sherlock Holmes outwitted both the local inspector and the colonel by making a deduction based on an event that never occurred. When asked if there was any particular detail that warranted attention, the great detective pointed to the curious behavior of the dog in the nighttime. The inspector noted that the dog had done absolutely nothing in the nighttime, to which Holmes famously replied that this was precisely the curious behavior. The stable was guarded by a dog, and yet a thief had entered, removed a horse, and departed without the animal making enough noise to wake the sleeping hands in the loft. The profound silence of the animal meant that the midnight visitor was not a stranger, but someone the dog knew well. By directing his formidable intellect toward an absence, toward the profound significance of what failed to happen, the detective separated his brilliant mind from the ordinary thinking of the local authorities. As we examine how the human mind attempts to envision the days and years ahead, we find that the rest of humanity shares the inspector's fundamental flaw. When we conjure our tomorrows, we almost never notice what our imagination fails to include, and these omitted details possess far more power over our future joy than we ever suspect. The sailors. Not anyone who has navigated a busy urban center is intimately familiar with the terrifying precision of pigeons. These birds seem to possess a supernatural ability to unleash their droppings at the exact trajectory required to ruin a newly purchased coat. Given their apparent ballistic genius, one might assume these creatures possess high intelligence. Yet, in simple laboratory tests, they prove remarkably obtuse. If a pigeon is placed in a cage with 2 levers, and one lever occasionally lights up, the bird will quickly learn to peck the illuminated lever to receive a seed. However, no amount of training will teach the same bird to peck the unilluminated lever for the same reward. The avian brain can easily grasp that the presence of a light signals dinner, but it is entirely incapable of understanding that the absence of a light could mean exactly the same thing. It is tempting to dismiss this as a mere quirk of bird biology, but human beings suffer from a remarkably similar cognitive deficit. Consider a psychological game in which subjects are shown sets of 3-letter combinations, such as SSY or GTR, and are asked to deduce what makes one specific combination in each set the special one. When the secret rule is that the special combination is the only one containing the letter T, subjects figure it out after observing a few dozen sets. The presence of the letter is noticeable. But when the secret rule is that the special combination is the only one lacking the letter T, the subjects completely fail to solve the puzzle, no matter how many sets they are shown. We are acutely attuned to the presence of a feature, but practically blind to its absence. Absence in the present. This inability to process missing information heavily distorts our judgment in everyday life. We remain convinced that urban pigeons are malicious snipers because we vividly recall the few horrific instances when a white dollop hit our shoulder. To truly assess the bird's accuracy, however, we would have to calculate the number of times we walked under a flock and emerged completely unscathed. The countless misses are absolutely essential for understanding the actual probability of a hit. Yet we never factor those non-events into our assessment. Scientists rely on complex mathematical formulas to evaluate both occurrences and non-occurrences when establishing facts, precisely because the human mind stubbornly refuses to do so on its own. Centuries ago, the philosopher Sir Francis Bacon highlighted this specific mental aberration, noting that human understanding is profoundly swayed by things that strike the senses directly, while paying almost no attention to the invisible things that do not. He illustrated his point with an ancient story of a visitor to a Roman temple who was shown a portrait of pious sailors who had prayed to the gods and miraculously survived a shipwreck. When pressured to accept this as undeniable proof of divine intervention, the visitor shrewdly asked to see the portraits of all the men who had prayed just as fervently but drowned anyway. The ordinary mind rarely asks to see the sailors who are not there. This blindness to absence leads us into a maze of contradictory choices. If asked to decide which 2 countries are most similar, perhaps East Germany and West Germany, or Ceylon and Nepal, most people will choose the 2 Germanys, focusing on the presence of shared traits like geography and language while ignoring the traits they do not share. Yet, if asked which 2 countries are the most dissimilar, people will again choose the 2 Germanys, focusing this time on the presence of distinctly different governments or economies, completely ignoring the lack of contrasting features. We look for what is there based on the question asked, completely disregarding the void. This explains why we might both book and then cancel the exact same vacation. Given a choice between a moderate island with average weather and average hotels, or an extreme island with breathtaking beaches but terrible nightlife, we select the extreme island because we are looking for positive features to affirm our choice. But if forced to cancel one of those reservations, we reject the extreme island because we are suddenly looking for negative features to justify our rejection. The rational approach would be to weigh the presence and absence of all traits simultaneously, but our minds are simply not built for that kind of ledger. Absence in the future. Just as we fail to notice the invisible elements of the past and the present, we construct fundamentally incomplete visions of our future. We can easily close our eyes and spend an hour daydreaming about driving a luxurious sports car. We can see the sleek lines of the hood, feel the grip of the leather steering wheel, and hear the hum of the engine. But no matter how vividly we paint this mental picture, we will eventually have to admit that we did not imagine the numbers on the license plate. It is perfectly natural that our imaginations omit certain details, but our fatal mistake lies in treating the unimagined details as if they simply will not exist in the future. We assume that the future will unfold exactly and only as we have pictured it. To grasp the emotional weight of this error, consider the unimaginable grief of losing a child. If asked how you would feel 2 years after such a tragedy, you would likely predict absolute, unmitigated devastation, perhaps even an inability to leave your bed. This prediction is drawn from the harrowing mental images that immediately flood your consciousness, receiving the terrible news, standing at the graveside, or staring into an empty room. Yet, the ensuing 2 years of life will not be composed exclusively of those agonizing moments. The days will inevitably be filled with thousands of other ordinary events. You will attend a play, share a meal with a friend, read a novel, or feel the warmth of the summer sun. None of these mundane occurrences can erase the profound loss, but they will inevitably exert their own subtle emotional influence on your daily existence. When we predict our future misery, we focus a spotlight entirely on the tragic event itself, leaving the vast surrounding landscape of daily life completely in the dark. This tunnel vision guarantees that we will misjudge the emotional impact of almost everything we anticipate. Students predicting their joy or sorrow over an upcoming football game dramatically overestimate how long those feelings will last. When they imagine a victory, they envision the cheering crowds and the final score, but they completely fail to envision the mundane chemistry studying they will have to do in the library a few hours later. Because they do not imagine the studying, they do not factor its sobering emotional weight into their prediction. We fall into the exact same trap when we imagine moving to a new city or acquiring a new physical condition. We assume residents of sunny coastal states are perpetually blissful because we envision the beaches and palm trees, while completely failing to imagine the congested traffic, the expensive housing, and the long lines at the supermarket. When sighted individuals try to imagine being blind, they mistakenly assume that blindness will consume every waking moment of their existence. They fail to realize that even without sight, a person still listens to beautiful music, enjoys a wonderful meal, and does their taxes. The missing details of our mental simulations are not trivial, they are the very fabric of our eventual reality. On the event horizon, imagine a man who has lived his entire life in a dense, enclosing jungle, stepping out onto a vast, open plain for the first time. Seeing a herd of buffalo grazing miles away on the horizon, he might laugh and ask what kind of insects those tiny black specks are. Having never experienced an unobstructed view of the distance, his brain does not understand that large objects appear small when they are far away. For those of us accustomed to open spaces, our visual system uses the presence of fine detail, the texture of a wing, the hairs on a leg, to tell us that an object is close. When those fine details smooth out and blur into a vague silhouette, our brain correctly interprets the object as distant. Our perception of time operates on the exact same principle, but with a crucial deceptive difference. The near future is highly textured and rigorously detailed, while the distant future is a smooth, abstract blur. If you think about an event happening tomorrow, like getting married or locking your front door, you envision the concrete mechanics, the specific outfit, the turn of the key and the brass lock. If you think about those same events happening a year from now, you envision them conceptually, making a lifelong commitment, or securing the premises. When we look at a distant buffalo, we know it is not actually a smooth, featureless blob. But when we look at a temporally distant event, we mistakenly believe that it will actually be as smooth and uncomplicated as our abstract mental image. This temporal illusion is the reason we so often agree to burdensome commitments weeks in advance, only to curse ourselves when the day finally arrives. When we agree to babysit young relatives a month from now, we are envisioning the abstract concept of family obligation and love, a smooth, rewarding idea. But when the actual Sunday arrives, we are suddenly confronted with the highly detailed reality of crying children, scattered toys, and spilled juice. The gritty texture of the event was entirely missing from our distant mental image, and we are genuinely shocked when we stumble over it. We plan a good day next year as a pure, uninterrupted flow of joy, while a good day tomorrow is realistically peppered with minor annoyances like running errands. We fail to recognize that next year's days will be just as lumpy and complicated as tomorrow's. This differing texture of time also skews our evaluation of delayed gratification. We would eagerly pay extra to experience a joy today rather than tomorrow because the immediate pleasure is sharply detailed and viscerally thrilling. Yet, we wouldn't pay a dime to move a pleasure from 365 days away to 364 days away. The one-day delay feels like agonizing torture when it is right in front of us, but completely insignificant when it is a year down the road. Our emotional centers simply do not fire when contemplating the blurry abstractions of the far future. Onward. Before the great detective returned to his lodgings, he offered a final, somewhat ungracious critique of the baffled police inspector. He suggested that the inspector simply lacked the imagination required to envision what might have happened. But this assessment missed the mark entirely. The inspector's failure was not a lack of imagination, but an unwavering, uncritical trust in it. Our minds are exceptionally gifted at filling in the blanks to create a seamless picture, and just as gifted at leaving vital information out. The tragedy is not that our brains perform these hidden edits. If they did not, our consciousness would be a fragmented nightmare. The danger lies in the fact that they do this editing so swiftly and silently that we never realize it has happened. We blindly accept our mental previews as literal blueprints of the future, expecting our tomorrows to unfold with the exact details we imagined and utterly devoid of the details we ignored. Part 5. Rationalization. Chapter 8. Paradise Glossed. If one seeks to improve their state of being, modern society offers an endless catalogue of superficial remedies, radical diets, cosmetic surgeries, esoteric stretching routines, and exotic botanical extracts, all promising to restore youth, sharpen the mind, and elevate the spirit. Yet, the most potent mechanism for achieving profound contentment requires none of these physical or chemical interventions. It is a built-in, fully autonomous feature of the human mind, an astonishing psychological mechanism capable of transmuting our current, flawed reality into an entirely palatable, even joyful existence. Our experiences are fundamentally ambiguous in nature, just as a two-dimensional drawing of a geometric cube can suddenly appear to flip its spatial orientation depending on how the observer chooses to look at it. The events in our lives can be interpreted through a multitude of different lenses. Some of these lenses reveal tragedy and failure, while others reveal triumph and opportunity. Research consistently demonstrates that human beings are remarkably adept at finding the most flattering angle once a circumstance becomes a permanent fixture in their lives. The moment an individual commits to a decision, whether it involves purchasing a kitchen appliance, accepting a new employment offer, or casting a ballot for a political candidate, their perception of that choice immediately improves. A prospective university or an unpurchased automobile might seem merely acceptable during the evaluation phase, but the moment it becomes our university or our automobile, it is suddenly transformed into the finest option available. We naturally hunt for the most affirmative interpretation of our own reality, spinning the ambiguous details of our existence into a favorable narrative. Finding facts. This relentless tendency to weave straw into gold might evoke the caricature of an eternally optimistic philosopher who insists that every tragedy is a hidden blessing. One might think of classical satires in which characters argue absurdly that the world is in its most perfect state, that human legs were specifically designed by nature merely to fit into trousers, or that noses were shaped expressly to serve the purpose of holding up spectacles. If our minds are indeed so incredibly adept at finding the silver lining in every storm cloud, one might reasonably wonder why we are not all walking around in a state of perpetual, delirious euphoria, actively giving thanks for our ailments, our financial ruins, and our misfortunes. The answer lies in the fact that while the human mind is highly adaptable, it is not completely divorced from reality. We navigate our days along the razor's edge between unvarnished truth and comforting self-deception. Neither extreme is entirely sustainable on its own. If we were forced to perceive the world with absolute unflinching objectivity, stripped of all personal bias, rationalization, and hopeful distortion, the sheer weight of life's bleakness and our own insignificance would likely paralyze us. Conversely, if our illusions were entirely unbound by the physical world, we would become dangerously delusional, completely incapable of navigating the basic hazards of our environment. We require a clear enough vision to construct buildings, pilot aircraft, and harvest crops. Yet we simultaneously require a slightly rosy, tinted lens to muster the necessary courage and motivation to undertake those arduous tasks in the first place. Thus, we possess what can be best described as a psychological immune system. Much like the body's biological defense network, which must carefully distinguish between invading pathogens that need destroying and native cells that must be protected, our psychological defenses must strike a delicate, life-saving balance. They work tirelessly behind the scenes to shield us from the despair of negative outcomes, buffering our emotional well-being without completely severing our tether to the factual world. They defend the mind against unhappiness just as white blood cells defend the body against disease. However, when reality presents us with an undeniable hardship, when a favored politician is caught in a scandalous lie, or when a personal failure cannot be swept under the rug, we face a cognitive dilemma. We cannot simply erase the facts, but we can fundamentally alter how we evaluate them. Because facts are essentially theories that have met a certain threshold of proof, we possess a subconscious ability to adjust that internal threshold depending on what we actually want to believe. We apply entirely different standards of scrutiny to information that supports our desires versus information that threatens them. When presented with evidence that confirms our preconceived notions or flatters our self-image, we ask ourselves, "Can I believe this?" Under this accommodating standard, we require only the flimsiest of justifications to accept the information as absolute truth. We readily embrace the data because it feels good to do so. However, when confronted with hostile, critical, or unflattering facts, we immediately shift our internal interrogation to a much more rigorous question. Must I believe this? Under this defensive standard, we demand an impossibly high level of proof, eagerly searching for any minor methodological flaw, any hint of bias, or any trivial inconsistency that might allow us to dismiss the unpleasant truth entirely. This uneven, highly prejudiced application of skepticism is perfectly illustrated when individuals are presented with conflicting scientific studies regarding contentious social issues. When observers review research on subjects like the deterrent effect of capital punishment, they will instinctively champion the methodology of the study that aligns with their personal politics, praising it as sound, objective science. Simultaneously, they become hyper-critical, peer-reviewing experts when dissecting the study that challenges their worldview, effortlessly identifying reasons to discard its findings. We do not objectively weigh the evidence in the scales of justice, rather, we systematically massage the data, cherry-pick the statistics, and manipulate the context until reality yields the exact conclusion we secretly desired from the start. We gather the facts, but we subject them to intense psychological editing, completely unaware that we are playing the roles of both the master illusionist and the captive audience. Part 5. Rationalization. Chapter 9. Immune to reality. At the dawn of the 20th century, a retired German school teacher named Wilhelm von Osten captivated the world with an extraordinary stallion named Clever Hans. This horse appeared to possess an intellect that rivaled that of many human beings. When von Osten asked the animal a question, Hans would tap his hoof against the ground to provide the answer. He could add, subtract, multiply, and divide. He could keep track of the calendar, spell out words, and answer queries about historical events. Astounded scientists and skeptics subjected the animal to rigorous testing and concluded that there was no trickery involved. Von Osten was not secretly signaling the horse. Yet, a perceptive psychologist eventually uncovered the brilliant reality. Hans could only answer a question if the person asking the question already knew the answer, and only if the horse could clearly see the questioner. The horse was not a mathematical prodigy. He was an unparalleled observer of human physiology. When Hans began tapping his hoof, the questioner would naturally exhibit an imperceptible buildup of physical tension, anticipating the correct number of taps. The moment Hans struck the final correct tap, the questioner would involuntarily relax. Hans simply stopped tapping whenever he saw this microscopic release of human tension. The profound lesson of Clever Hans is not about the intelligence of horses, but about the profound blindness of human beings. The questioners were providing the answers to the horse, but they were doing so entirely without their own knowledge or intent. They were completely oblivious to their own behavior. This historical curiosity offers a powerful metaphor for the inner workings of human psychology. When we experience emotional pain, our brains immediately begin working to alleviate it. We search for silver linings, we highlight the hidden benefits of a tragedy, and we convince ourselves that the things we cannot have are not the things we truly wanted anyway. But for this psychological defense mechanism to be effective, it must operate entirely outside of our conscious awareness. If we were fully aware that we were intentionally fabricating excuses or manipulating our perspective just to make ourselves feel better, the comfort would instantly evaporate. A rationalization only works if we genuinely believe it to be a spontaneous, objective discovery of truth. To successfully protect our emotional well-being, the brain must essentially lie to us, and we must never catch it in the act. We are akin to patrons in a fine restaurant, savoring a meticulously prepared meal in the elegant dining room, blissfully unaware of the frantic chef chopping and boiling in the dark basement below. We consume the comforting narratives our minds produce, but we remain entirely blind to the intense cognitive labor that manufactured them. The ultimate cost of this unconscious mechanism is that we are effectively strangers to our own psychological resilience. Because we do not see the chef in the basement, we fail to anticipate the meals he will cook for us in the future. Consider the profound devastation of being left at the altar. If we were to survey a group of individuals who had actually endured the heartbreak and public humiliation of a fiancé walking out on their wedding day, a surprising number of them would eventually describe the event as one of the best things that ever happened to them. They would view it as a painful but necessary catalyst that steered them away from a disastrous marriage and toward personal growth or a superior life partner. Yet, if we were to ask a currently engaged person to imagine how they would feel if their betrothed abandoned them, they would predict absolute, unmitigated despair. When we look forward to a potential tragedy, we envision the raw pain of the event itself. We fail to envision our own psychological immune system rushing in to reconstruct the narrative, soothe the wound, and restore our happiness. Our prospect is characterized by terror, but our retrospect is characterized by profound rationalization. Because we do not realize that our brains will relentlessly shop for a more favorable view of the catastrophe, we mistakenly assume that the bleakness we feel when imagining the future is exactly how we will feel when we are actually living it. This fundamental blind spot gives rise to a bizarre psychological phenomenon, the paradox of intensity. It stands to reason that an enormous emotional trauma should cause far more enduring agony than a minor irritation. However, our internal defense systems are designed much like physical emergency responses. They require a critical threshold of distress to activate. An intense suffering, such as a major professional termination or a devastating personal betrayal, sounds a cognitive alarm. It forces the psychological immune system into high gear, compelling us to find meaning, rationalize the loss, and ultimately move on. A minor annoyance, on the other hand, such as a stubbed toe, a delayed train, or a mildly rude comment, does not breach the threshold required to trigger our psychological defenses. Consequently, the massive traumas are rapidly neutralized by our coping mechanisms, while the minor nuisances are left to fester indefinitely. We often find it much easier to genuinely forgive a partner for a massive, relationship-threatening failure than to stop being irritated by their daily habit of chewing too loudly. We heal from the large wounds because our mental antibodies fight them. We suffer from the small ones because our minds simply do not bother to deploy the troops. We can observe this dynamic when we compare our reactions to different types of personal slights. Imagine receiving a highly clinical, exceptionally cruel evaluation of your personality from a professional psychologist. If you were the direct target of this character assassination, your ego would be severely threatened. This intense threat would immediately activate your rationalizing defenses. You would quickly find reasons to discredit the psychologist, determining that their methodology was flawed or that they were inherently biased, and you would soon return to your normal state of self-confidence. But what if you were merely a bystander, reading an unfairly cruel evaluation directed at a stranger? The minor empathetic sting you feel would not be intense enough to trigger your psychological immune system. You would not feel compelled to aggressively debunk the psychologist's credibility. As a result, long after the actual victim had rationalized the insult and moved on, you, the bystander, might continue to harbor a lingering, low-grade negativity about the entire affair. Because we do not anticipate that intense suffering will trigger our psychological rescue operations, we chronically mispredict our emotional endurance. Our psychological immune system is also deeply sensitive to another condition that we rarely factor into our future plans. Inescapability. We have an extraordinary capacity to make peace with the things we cannot change. We tolerate deep flaws in our siblings that we would rapidly condemn in our casual acquaintances simply because we cannot resign from our biological families. When a situation is temporary or escapable, our first instinct is to change the situation. We return bad meals, we exchange ill-fitting clothes, and we walk away from unpleasant conversations. But when a situation is absolute, permanent, and irrevocable, changing the situation is no longer an option. Instead, our brains execute a brilliant maneuver. They change our perspective of the situation. We find a way to love the dilapidated house we are locked into. We discover hidden virtues in the political candidate who has securely won the election, and we embrace the unalterable realities of our physical health. We weave straw into gold only when we absolutely cannot afford silk. Yet, when we gaze into the future, we operate in complete defiance of this reality. We actively seek out choices that are reversible, completely unaware that reversible choices are precisely the ones that leave us perpetually dissatisfied. If a student is allowed to choose one piece of artwork to keep from a collection, their ultimate happiness with that art depends entirely on whether they are allowed to change their mind later. The student who is told their choice is absolutely final will quickly develop a deep affection for the selected piece, their brain highlighting its beauty and validating the decision because it cannot be undone. The student who is given a week to swap the art for a different piece remains in psychological purgatory. Because the choice is escapable, their psychological immune system never activates to defend it. They continue to weigh the alternatives, endlessly second-guessing their decision and ultimately feeling far less joy. Because we do not understand the mechanics of our own resilience, we dedicate immense energy to avoiding the very circumstances that would trigger our deepest healing. We demand the freedom to alter our commitments. We avoid definitive conclusions, and we treat ourselves as delicate vessels incapable of surviving a massive emotional impact. We design our futures around the false premise that our grief will last forever, and that our choices must remain open, unaware that commitment and inevitability are the true architects of our ultimate contentment. Part 6. Corrigibility. Chapter 10. Once Bitten. In recent years, the market for children's literature has been flooded with brightly illustrated volumes dedicated entirely to the mechanics of using the toilet. Some of these books are remarkably anatomical, while others rely on cheerful drawings of toddlers proudly mastering the mysteries of indoor plumbing. Yet, despite their varying approaches, all of these books share a singular, foundational premise. Human beings are capable of learning from their experiences. The fundamental promise of growing up is that once we suffer the discomfort of a soiled diaper or the sting of a careless mistake, we will catalog that negative outcome and modify our future behavior to avoid it. We look upon the elderly with a certain reverence, assuming that their decades on earth have endowed them with a vast, protective wealth of experiential knowledge. We trust that a person who has endured the trials of life will naturally refrain from making the same blunders twice. To a certain extent, this is true. There are specific, visceral mistakes that a person with a wealth of experience simply will not repeat. However, an honest assessment of human behavior reveals a rather embarrassing truth. We routinely commit the exact same errors over and over again. We find ourselves drawn to romantic partners who share the exact flaws of our former spouses. We dutifully attend the same dysfunctional holiday gatherings year after year, vowing each time that we will never return. We fall into the identical financial traps at the end of every month. If experience is such a profound teacher, why do we so frequently fail to learn its lessons? If our capacity to simulate the future is flawed when we are facing an entirely novel situation, we might be forgiven. But when we are contemplating a scenario we have lived through multiple times, we should be able to rely on our memories to accurately forecast our emotional reactions and steer us clear of repeated misery. We should be able to do this, but we often cannot, simply because our memories of our own experiences are profoundly distorted. As we have seen, the human memory does not operate like a faithful stenographer transcribing a perfect, unedited record of our lives. Instead, it functions as a highly opinionated film editor, snipping away the vast majority of our daily footage and saving only a few dramatic frames. When we wish to recall an event, the brain stitches these fragmented clips together, filling in the gaps with plausible inventions to create a coherent narrative. Usually, this editorial process serves us well, discarding the mundane and preserving the essential. But this system possesses inherent biases that trick us into misinterpreting our own pasts, which in turn causes us to severely mismanage our futures. One of the most profound editorial biases of memory is its tendency to confuse the ease of recalling an event with the frequency of that event's occurrence. Because highly unusual, traumatic, or intensely joyful moments are so thoroughly bookmarked in our minds, they leap into our consciousness with almost no effort. The brain then falsely concludes that because these memories are so readily available, the events they depict must happen all the time. Consider the universal conviction that we are cursed to always choose the slowest moving line at the supermarket. Most of us genuinely feel that the moment we switch to a faster lane, our new lane grinds to a halt, while our previous line suddenly flows freely. We feel this way not because the universe is actively conspiring against our groceries, but because standing in a line that moves at a normal, uneventful pace is incredibly boring and completely unmemorable. We only actively register our experience when we are trapped behind a customer attempting to pay with pennies or arguing over an expired coupon. Because the infuriating delays are the only instances we actually remember, our brains calculate the frequency of these delays and conclude that we are uniquely plagued by bad luck. We base our future choices on a historical ledger that has recorded all of our frustrations and erased all of our seamless successes. This distortion is magnified by another of memory's deepest quirks, an absolute obsession with endings. When we reflect on an episode in our lives, we do not calculate the total sum of pleasure or pain we experienced from start to finish. Instead, we heavily weight our judgment toward the final moments of the event. To observe this, one need only look at how human beings evaluate physical pain. If forced to endure a specific agony, such as plunging a hand into a bucket of freezing water, people will logically prefer a shorter duration of pain to a longer one, but this logic vanishes if the longer duration is punctuated by a slightly better ending. If a person keeps their hand in freezing water for 60 seconds, it is agonizing. If they keep it in that exact same freezing water for 60 seconds, but then the temperature of the water is slightly warmed for an additional 30 seconds, the total amount of pain they endure is objectively greater. They suffered the initial 60 seconds, plus an extra half-minute of discomfort. Yet because the prolonged experience ended on a marginally more pleasant note, the individual's memory will record the entire event as having been less painful than the shorter trial. If given the choice to repeat one of the experiences, they will astonishingly choose the longer trial, volunteering for more total pain simply to secure a less painful memory. This fetish for finales dictates how we evaluate entire human lives. If we are asked to judge the quality of a person's life, we find ourselves strongly biased by the trajectory of their final years. Imagine a person who lives an utterly spectacular, vibrant, and joyous life, but who dies abruptly in their prime. Now imagine another person who lives that exact same spectacular life, but instead of dying at their peak, they live an additional 5 years of merely average, mundane existence. When asked to evaluate these lives, observers will consistently rate the shorter, unblemished life as superior to the longer one. We instinctively feel that a period of mediocrity at the end of a life ruins the narrative, even though the longer life contained the exact same amount of intense joy as the shorter one, plus a few extra years of decent living. Our memory simply cannot tolerate a declining narrative arc. We care vastly more about how the story finishes than how much total happiness was accumulated along the way. If we misremember the frequency of our frustrations and misjudge the sum of our pain based on how it ends, our ability to learn from the past is already severely compromised, but our retrospection suffers from an even more devastating flaw. We tend to remember feeling exactly what we expected to feel, rather than what we actually felt. When a highly anticipated event occurs, whether it is a pivotal political election, a crucial sporting match, or a significant personal milestone, we typically make grand predictions about how we will react. We expect to be completely elated by a victory or permanently crushed by a defeat. When the event finally transpires, our actual emotional response is almost always more moderate and less enduring than we predicted. The joy fades into normalcy, and the devastation gives way to daily routine. However, when we are asked months later to recall how we felt when that event occurred, our memories do not retrieve our actual moderated emotions. Instead, they retrieve our initial predictions. We remember being absolutely devastated or boundlessly elated, exactly as our personal theories dictated we should be. This final illusion is the lock on the prison door. If our predictions about the future are consistently wrong, we should theoretically notice this discrepancy when the future arrives, learn from our poor forecasting, and adjust our expectations for the next time. But because we rewrite our memories of the past to perfectly match our incorrect predictions, we never discover that we were wrong in the first place. Our imagined pasts and our imagined futures are in perfect, unholy agreement, both insisting that our emotional lives are far more extreme than reality proves them to be. We fail to learn from our experiences because our minds fundamentally refuse to keep an accurate record of them. As we will see, this blindness to our own adaptability requires us to seek wisdom elsewhere, though we are often far too proud to accept it.